Halachically and logically, you cannot transact with something that you don't yet have. So watch the fascinating way in which the Rebbe links that to whether or not we can make spiritual resolutions that we don't know that we'll keep. Klal hu b'dinei kinyonim, one of the cardinal principles of acquisitions is that that a person cannot transact over something that doesn't yet exist. So if something hasn't yet come into existence, I can't sell it to you, I cannot gift it to you. Let's tie that to practical halacha. Therefore, if a person says, I'm selling you the fruit of my palm tree, and I make that pledge, that commitment, before any of the fruit has begun to blossom, the person would be allowed to change their mind, even once those fruits are on the tree and ripe. Why? Because I made a deal with you about something that didn't exist at the time of the deal. However, but if the person says, I am acquiring to you my palm tree to the extent that you may take its fruits, right? There's our example, like a tree that I'm acquiring to in order that you should be able to take the fruits. Then that's a different category. That's not considered as if you're making a deal over something that does not yet exist. Because the tree, which is involved in this deal, does exist. And I'm making the transaction to give you rights to the tree, which now exists. And those rights extend to the point that you could take the fruit. So that's the general principle, but there's an exception. The Rambam says actually there are a few exceptions. That if a person wants to sanctify something for the Beis Hamikdash, or if a person wants to pledge for poor people, i.e. tzedakah, or if a person makes a vow, a promise about what they're going to do, then the law is different to an ordinary transaction between two people. Let's say a person says, whatever this particular animal gives birth to in the future, it's not even pregnant now, I will donate to the Beis Hamikdash, or tzedakah, or I'll give it to tzedakah. A person says, if this deal goes through, I'm going to give X amount of money to tzedakah. So obviously, nothing can affect the item itself. You can't tell me that this animal, which has not even yet been conceived, is already holy, nor can you say the money is already tzedakah, that I don't have. So it's not that the item becomes designated, but I have a personal obligation to fulfill my pledge. Because the Torah tells us in our parasha that whatever comes out of a person's mouth, a person has to do what they have said they will do. In other words, even though the principle remains the same, you cannot designate something as holy or tzedakah, etc., before it exists. But there is a responsibility of the person who opened their mouth to keep his words midin neder, because that fits into the category of keeping your promises. The Rambam then applies that to another scenario. Seeing as that's true, let's say, God forbid, somebody's on their deathbed and they instruct, they say, you see that tree in my garden, all the fruit that tree produces in the future, the fruit doesn't yet exist, needs to be given as charity to the poor. The poor have a claim on those fruits. Why? Because it's tzedakah and we have to honor his pledge. And now says the Rambam, there are great sages who disagree with this principle and say that a poor person is in the same category as an ordinary person and cannot acquire something that did not exist at the time that the pledge was made. That's what others say. Says that, and therefore even the poor cannot acquire something that does not yet exist. The Rambam rejects that. He says, I don't agree with this. You're right. The person is not required to make the transaction for something that doesn't yet exist, but he is required to keep his word. Especially when it's about charity or when it's about making something hektish. In the same way as a person has to keep any verbal commitment that they make. Now, we're not going to focus so much on that. We're going to focus rather on the two key examples, which is that I cannot transact over something that doesn't yet exist unless it's tzedakah or hektish or just a pledge, a neder that a person makes. When what the Rebbe is going to extract from this is, as explained multiple times, every halacha in Torah besides the obvious, which is the halachic message, also has an instruction in how we should behave in our spiritual development. As the Rambam calls it, everything in Torah is an eitzah, advice, in human development, in personal improvement. Here's the exact quote from the Rambam. The majority of the laws of the Torah are pieces of advice that to get our minds right and to straighten our behaviors. So therefore we have to apply that to our scenario here. We've identified two laws in this particular context about transactions. The first is that if I say I'm selling you fruit and the fruit hasn't yet begun to grow, it's a meaningless transaction. Whereas if I say I'm selling you the right to my tree for its fruit, that is a binding transaction. That's the one. And secondly, the distinction between when an ordinary person makes an ordinary transaction with another ordinary person, where there is no requirement by Torah that I have to make such a transaction, and therefore it's not binding unless the item exists already, as compared to if a person makes a pledge either to the Beis Hamikdash or to Tzedakah, where the Torah does expect that I will keep my words. In which case I am liable to fulfill my pledge, even if I pledged about something that does not yet exist. Those two principles, both apply to our spiritual service of the Eibishter. So, what is our spiritual service of the Eibishter if you had to summarize it? The summary of the experience of serving Hashem is Asiyas Kinyan, to make things the Eibishter's possession. In other words, I have to transact in a way that I give myself and everything about my life to the Eibishter, that it should become his possession. Which means, in plain English, that means anybody who looks at me can see I belong to the Eibishter. Anybody who looks at my assets can see they belong to the Eibishter. How do I get there? The way I do that is, I think the way the Eibishter wants, I speak the way that the Eibishter wants, and I conduct myself in the way that the Eibishter wants. And that is actually what the Chazal in Kiddushin were telling us, that I was created in order to serve Koini. What's Koini? Not my creator. Koini, the one who acquires me. Why is that? Because when I'm serving the Eibishter and all of the things in my life are directed to serve the Eibishter, then you can see that the Eibishter, so to speak, owns me. I am the Eibishter's possession. This concept that a Jewish person is the Eibishter's asset is something we'll experience in its ultimate form when Mashiach comes. As one of the famous prophecies about Mashiach's times is, at that time Yosef says, the Eibishter is going to once again stretch out his arm to acquire his people. And we see a similar thing in Haftarah. In Oz Yashir, that the Eibishter says when he took the Yidden out of Mitzrayim that he acquired the people. This concept that we, so to speak, make ourselves the Eibishter's possession can happen in two ways, which are actually two spiritual levels. Reflected in the halacha, kinyan haguf, where you sell the item itself, kinyan haperos, or you only sell the rights to the product of that item. So let's understand the spiritual distinction between them. What's the difference between the principal item and its produce in spiritual terms? So guf, who, if I'm going to speak about the principal element, what's the principle of a human being? That refers to the person's soul, the person's body, and all of the powers, the abilities that the person has, which includes his intellectual abilities, and all of his emotional attributes, and all the potential that the person has, which includes the potential to think, to speak, and to act. All of that is considered in guf. In other words, it's a full package deal. Whereas a peiros, if I'm only describing the fruits of that original entity, then that would refer to him. That would speak about the things that I've done, or that I'm doing, or that are related to the garments of the soul, as Alter Rebbe describes them in Tanya, which is not my capacity for thought, the actual thoughts, not my potential for speech, the words that I say, not the potential for action, the things I actually do. Like the famous saying of Chazal, that told us, what are the children, so to speak, the produce of great people, of tzaddikim, is good deeds. These are the things that grow out, like the fruit grows from the tree, so our behavior, etc., grows from us. And so if we're going to describe how we serve the Eibishter, we can distinguish between acquiring the entire package or just acquiring the produce of that package. So, Kinyan Peres Pirushai. Let's talk about first, if the Eibishter acquires my payros, my productivity, my produce, what does that mean? It means that I donate to the Eibishter my thoughts, my speech, my action, which are the product of my soul, all the abilities my soul has, all the garments of the soul. So that means that a person is absolutely vigilant to the extreme, that the way he thinks, talks, and behaves are always completely aligned with what the Eibishter wants. This is what the Alter Rebbe in Tanya describes as the level of the Beinoni. Will never transgress what the Eibishter says you may not transgress. So he never has and he never will. This is a person who will never be described as a Rasha ever in their life. Why? Because they go to the extreme to ensure thought, speech, and action are completely aligned with what Hashem wants. But despite this person's incredible behavior, the guf, the actual essence of who the person is, etzem haseichel, the core of the intellect, hamidus, the core of the emotional makeup, vehakoicha sheloi, and all of the potential for performance which the person has, loy nikri lekuchabricha, that's not yet in the Eibishter's dominion. The person is not yet free of distracting or inappropriate thoughts or the desires for things which are inappropriate, which are hatched in the heart and float their way up into the mind, and a person starts to think about that. The person doesn't have that level of absolute freedom from those distractions. Rather, here we're talking about somebody who has dominion over the Yetzer Hara, that cannot wrest control of the human experience. Which means that this is somebody, the Beinoni of Tanya, who never permits a stray thought or a desire to translate into action, to translate into words, or even to translate into a thought that he will allow to perpetuate. In other words, thoughts drop into your head, but he won't allow himself to entertain those thoughts. That's called Kinyan Peres. I have designated for the Eibishter all the reality of my life, the practicality of my life. The core of my being still needs work. Whereas when you speak about acquiring the entire entity, then you're speaking the language of a tzaddik. The tzaddik is not just somebody who behaves appropriately, that from our perspective we say, wow, that is a model citizen, but rather this is somebody who's completely designated to Hashem, the whole mind, the whole emotion. And he gets there by totally neutralizing the entire capacity of his Yetzer Hara. Not like the Beinoni, who still has a Yetzer Hara nagging and saying, behave this way. The tzaddik has neutralized the Yetzer Hara completely. It doesn't have a voice. Any negativity within the brain, any negativity within the emotional structure, any negativity within the potential for behavior is gone. It's been completely cleansed. Which is why the tzaddik only desires things that are healthy and holy. Seeing as the tzaddik has completely designated every part of his being to the Eibishter, it goes without saying that once the brain is Hashem's brain, obviously it's only going to think things which are aligned with what Hashem wants, and the same applies to midas, and therefore the way the person speaks and behaves, etc. The tzaddik will never have a struggle or a battle to ensure that behavior conforms to what the Eibishter wants, because it's not possible to have an alternative. Because he's cleansed his heart, therefore there is no desire for inappropriate behaviors, so there's no need for self-control. Again, referring to what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, why the tzaddik is called the Eibishter's servant. Because the Eved of Torah is somebody who is owned by the Adon, by the master. Owned. His entirety is owned. And that's what a tzaddik is. So the halacha is that the Eved belongs to the master, and therefore, naturally, anything that the Eved acquires automatically belongs to the master, even if the master has never seen it. That's why we refer to the tzaddik as a servant of Hashem, because his avodah is similar. He completely designates every part of himself to the Eibishter. Naturally, whatever comes into his life is naturally aligned with what the Eibishter wants. So we've got these two possibilities. The majority of people who, at best, are able to dedicate their behavior to be aligned with what Hashem wants, and the unique tzaddik who's able to dedicate every fiber of his being to be completely dedicated to Hashem. With that information, let's go back to the halacha, which is you cannot transact on something that doesn't yet exist. What does that mean in spiritual terms? You and I, right? We're not at the level of a tzaddik, so we haven't reached this point where everything is the Eibishter's asset. We're at the point where our behavior is dedicated to Hashem. In other words, that means what I'm able to offer the Eibishter right now is I'll think the way you want me to think, I'll speak the way you want me to think, you want me to speak, I'll behave the way that you want me to behave. I'm not at that level yet that I could say my brain is a godly brain completely. My emotions are godly emotions completely. I can't say that. I still have stuff that I'm trying to deal with that I have to manage. So that person has to be honest with themselves and realize that the only part of myself I can control, and it will take a battle to do so, is behavior including thought and speech. And that's only in the now. But you cannot assure or ensure that in the future you're going to be able to, right now you're winning the battle. Today's a good day. Thinking right, speaking right, behaving right. I can't promise that tomorrow's going to be the same. I don't know. I haven't fixed the internal works of my system. So the Yetzer Hara could throw me an ambush tomorrow that I don't anticipate. Therefore, if today I take a resolution for my spiritual growth in the future, I haven't now turned that future into the Eibishter's asset. I could change my mind. Like the guy who says, I'm sending you the fruit of the tree. Oops, actually I'm not sending you the fruit of the tree. I have no guarantee, because my life is a consistent spiritual battle, I have no guarantee that the well-intentioned resolution I made for tomorrow is actually going to happen tomorrow. So you cannot call it a kinyan. We don't know the status yet. Because my body, like the tree, doesn't belong to the other person. My body, my mind, my heart does not belong to the Eibishter. And the reality of my inner toxicity is still alive and well, but it has not even dissipated over the course of time. My behavior has improved. My inner workings have not shifted fundamentally. Therefore, every single day, and probably multiple times a day, I have battles with my Yetzer Hara, which is constantly trying to dissuade me or interfere with my growth. Every single moment, every single day, or multiple times through the course of the day, I have to fight to ensure that the Yetzer Hara does not infect my mind. And through that, how I speak and behave. Therefore, it is possible that I'll make this grand resolution for tomorrow. When the time arrives, God forbid, maybe my Yetzer Hara will get the upper hand and not permit me to actually fulfill the resolution I made. Therefore, the kinyan, the fact that future experience of my life is already God's, I don't know if that's true. But it's not all bad news, because despite that, the majority of us who are not at the position that we can say we have the full package deal, every fiber of our being is God's, like the tzaddik does, which would mean that we totally modify our entire intellectual processing and our whole emotional being to be aligned completely with Hashem. So you could say, I'm lost. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. There is advice. There is a way to be able to make those fruits that have not yet come into the world belong to the Eibishter. Again, in the same way, I want you to have the fruits of my palm tree, but the fruits haven't even begun to blossom yet. So what I say, the tree is yours to the extent that you could have the fruits. There's a similar spiritual mechanism that we could use to kind of force a successful resolution. What is it? You've got to follow a method similar to saying you have the tree to the extent that you can take its fruit. Claim, in other words, that means I'm not giving you the whole tree. In the same way, spiritually, the person says, I'm not in a position to give my entire self to the Eibishter unflinchingly. But a person is capable of saying, I'm giving the Eibishter my everything to the extent that it influences my choices and behavior. Okay, that might sound abstract. Here's the explanation. If you learn in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains to us that although primarily the area of impact of a Beinoni is thought, speech, and action, it's not limited only to thought, speech, and action. Why? So in other words, if it was only limited to thought, speech, and action, that would mean any time that there is some kind of temptation, he would quell it, he'd shut it down, and make sure it doesn't translate into real behavior. It's more than that. The Alter Rebbe explains to us that the Beinoni's efforts do produce some effect on the structure of the person's intellect and the nature of their emotions. The Alter Rebbe explains that the way the Beinoni works, it is possible that it could do something that is so spiritually impactful that it leaves a residual impact on his, not just behavior, but even his inclinations during the course of the day. What's the great example of this? Like the Alter Rebbe explains, that when a Beinoni davens, during the course of his very focused contemplative davening, the Beinoni is able to awaken within himself a love for the Eibishter that is palpable, that is real, that he feels temporarily like a tzaddik. And it's so potent that during the experience of davening, he literally sedates his nefesh habahamis, his animal soul, his yetzer hara, all the negativity within himself. Then the Alter Rebbe tells us, so that firstly tells us that the person has done more than just self-disciplined thought, speech, and action. They've actually modified feeling. I'm feeling a love for Hashem. Not only that, says the Alter Rebbe, once the davening is over, there's a residual impact of that love that he felt during the davening that remains. And therefore, that's going to empower the Beinoni during the course of the day. When temptation arises, he'll have the upper hand over that temptation, which means it will be that little bit easier for him to have self-control. Why? Because there's the afterglow of the love of Hashem that he felt during davening. So that tells us that his emotions shifted, and the shift had a lasting impact on the course of the day. Or Befrat, especially. One of the things that the Alter Rebbe tells us clearly is that in the space of davening, the experience of love towards Hashem that the Beinoni has is genuine, it's authentic, it's 100% real. For which reason it will last indefinitely. That authenticity has lasting impact. How so? Because now it's part of his system, which means it's a little bit easier the next time to awaken that love of Hashem, and that way again to sedate the negativity within himself. How? Practically, every single day when he davens. Each time deepens and makes more accessible that love of Hashem. Which tells us not only does the Beinoni have practical self-control, so that he's not out of line in terms of what he thinks or allows himself to think, says and does, but it's more than that. It's that he literally can make a shift inside of himself, and that shift would be able to impact a lasting love of Hashem. And that gives us a deeper insight into the comment that the Alter Rebbe makes in describing the Beinoni, which is difficult to wrap our heads around, where he says that the Beinoni has never done an Avera. Okay, fine, we can probably deal with that because maybe he's done tshuva to the extent that whatever was in his past is completely converted. But then he says, and the Beinoni will never do an Avera again in the future. How do you know that? Isn't that the same issue we've spoken about? If you don't have absolute self-mastery like the tzaddik, where every facet of your being is aligned with Hashem, how can you guarantee that you'll never transgress in the future? Why is that? Because where the Beinoni is in the now, with this feeling of love of Hashem, that has shifted his internal works, that gives him the power that as he is now, he is immune to doing an Aveira in the future. Because the Beinoni has control over the midos, the emotional drive, the subjective responses of the Yetzer Hara. Like the person is saying, the tree is yours, to the extent that you can take the peiros. What kind of control does the Beinoni have over the Yetzer Hara? Not absolute control, but control to the extent that it can ensure where the peiros are going to go, that thought, speech, and action will be aligned with Hashem. It's just that the Beinoni hasn't yet reached the mastery of a tzaddik, which has absolute control over the midos. But control to the extent of how it interprets into my behavior, that control he has. That would speak to this idea of saying, I am gifting or selling you this tree to the extent that you could have the peiros. The tree's not yours, but the peiros are guaranteed to be yours. A person can also get to that level spiritually. The whole being is not the Eibishter's, but the behavior is completely dedicated to the Eibishter. Even the person who does not have the opportunity to have this complete self-mastery over the midas, which means that the person is not at the point that they can eradicate the possibility of temptation. That's tzaddik world. But the Beinoni is capable, and every one of us is aspiring to become a Beinoni, to some extent is capable, to have that level of suppression of inappropriate desires, temptations, feelings, etc. Certainly to the extent that they influence behaviors. And that way the person can actually guarantee that the peiros, tomorrow's thoughts, tomorrow's words, tomorrow's behavior, that are not yet in this world, they belong to the Eibishter. Why? Because I have enough self-mastery to ensure that there isn't the type of temptation that would lead to inappropriate choices. That's the designation of the Beinoni, who will never in the future transgress because they have such a solid hold over where they are now. Let's look at this from a different angle. As we've already described, the majority of people are not going to become Hashem's servant like a tzaddik, where my entire being is the Eibishter's asset. I'm purely the Eibishter's tool. One thing we do know is that every single one of us is the Eibishter's agent and representative in this world. And when you're appointed as a shliach, you're empowered to fulfill your mission. Our mission is to transform our world into the Eibishter's home. Why do we have that power? Because the expression is that an individual's shliach becomes like them, and the Adam that is the sender of the shliach can also refer to Adam ha'elyon, to the supernal human, in other words, Hashem himself. And not only can we be similar to the Mishalech, representative of the Mishalech, but Kemoised the Mishalech Mamish, we literally could, in a sense, be the representation of, be the Mishalech. The Rebbe has explained this elsewhere. There are multiple layers of shlichus. The highest level of shlichus is the lowest level of shlichus is, I'm doing what the Mashalech wants. He said, do this mission, I fulfilled this mission. Higher level, not only are my actions what the Mashalech wants, but the capacity to make those actions, the koyach I have, belongs to the Mashalech, or is associated with the Mashalech. The highest level is where a person reaches the point, like for example a malach who is called by Hashem's name when he is Hashem's shliach. So in other words, you look at the shliach and what do you see? Eibishter. And naturally, of course, if I am that transparent, that I'm seen as, that I'm identified with the Mishalech, naturally whatever I do is what the Eibishter wants done. So as a shliach of Hashem, I can have that level of mastery that ensures that everything I do is aligned with what Hashem wants, even if I'm not an Eved, where everything about me belongs to Hashem. The shliach is not the same as an Eved. And it says, a servant has no personal identity. Everything about him is purely chattel. It's an asset of his master. Shliach is very different. Even the shliach is the highest level of dedication to his mission and to the person who gave him the mission, where not only is the person's mission, not only are their activities around the mission, but the person himself will be completely identified with and seen as the proxy of the one who sent them. That's only in context of the shlichus. Not his other things. So in other words, the Eved picks up an item. Oh wow, I found money on the floor. Money belongs to the master. Shliach is doing his mission with absolute dedication. There's money on the floor? Okay, it's mine. And in other words, the shlichus gives him mastery over the mission, not over his entire being. That means that every single one of us actually has a means by which we can totally dedicate to Hashem. We can dedicate ourselves to be the Eibishter's representative to fulfill the purpose of creation. And if we have that kind of dedication to Hashem, designation of self, transactional connection to Hashem, at least to the extent that we're committing ourselves so that all the peiros are what Hashem wants, that will affect us in such a way that it's almost natural, almost automatic, that whatever we do is aligned with what Hashem wants. And it goes deeper than that, because the minute it's what Hashem wants, there's an added impetus. That's why the Rambam adds another layer of innovation to the halacha, which is if what we're dealing with is holy items, the halachas are not the same as when you're dealing with just two individuals who are trying to make a transaction. If a person announces everything that this animal gives birth to in the future will all be designated as holy, you have to keep it. That has a spiritual implication as well. If there are some of us who are not even at the point that we could say we have so much dedication, like the Beinoni does, where they can shift an internal emotional state to feel a compelling love of Hashem, that will influence them, that naturally they'll only think, say, and do what Hashem wants. Many of us are struggling on a daily basis to think, do, and say what Hashem wants. If the person has zero control over the essence of their emotional being, their subjective responses, not even the level of control of the midas behind how I should speak and behave. Which means that this person surely should have absolutely no capacity to be able to ensure those resolutions, meaning to be able to ensure that what I want to transform into holiness, I can actually do. Which means every single time that there's something I'm supposed to do, which the Eibishter expects of me, I'm going to go through the whole fight again. There goes the Yetzer Hara trying to get in my way again, and I've got to overcome it every single day. It's got a new excuse, and I've got to find a way to counter it. But where does a person battle to control their future? That's if you're talking about ordinary activities. The Torah doesn't tell me that I have to make transactions. It's not a Torah thing, it's a human thing. In other words, that describes the things that the Torah permits me to do but doesn't instruct me to do. For example, I'm allowed to eat, I'm allowed to do business. It's not natural that that's going to be a holy experience. But when it comes to hektish, which is anything associated with holiness, in other words, Torah and mitzvahs, I'm going to make good resolutions with regards to Torah and mitzvahs. There the Torah tells me, you say it, you're required to keep it. In fact, I'm required to do these things to start with. It's true that if I make a commitment now to Torah and mitzvahs, that's not going to change my circumstances automatically, especially my future circumstances. But what it is going to do is going to bind me into an obligation. I am obligated now to keep my word because I made the promise, I made the pledge, I'm required by Torah to fulfill it. And whenever I'm required by Torah to do something, that means I'm empowered by Torah to do so. Which means this. Anything which is part of what the Torah permits, that is in the purview of me, my stuff. the way I like to eat, the way I like to keep myself healthy, the way I like to do business, the way I like to socialize. I'm not transgressing anything. It's my world. So why do I want to do these things and succeed in these areas? It's good for me. It's going to make me sustainable. Then it's possible to add a very important ingredient that my neshama then could have influence over these areas, that they could be directed towards Hashem. So they're not just plain, they're actually elevated experiences, holy experiences. But even when I eat with higher intention, the fact is it's my eating, my food, to fulfill my body, my needs. It's still all in the realm of things that are permitted, which means human stuff. And human stuff, I don't have the capacity to guarantee tomorrow. On the other hand, anything associated with Torah mitzvahs really is the neshama's world. It's just that the Yetzer Hara keeps getting in the way, trying to prevent the neshama from doing what the neshama naturally wants. So how do I get to actually do the mitzvah when the Yetzer Hara is trying to distract me? The neshama has to overwhelm the Yetzer Hara to the extent that it's weakened and neutralized, so that the neshama can get on with the job of what it really wants to do. Which explains the distinction between the mundane and the holy. When I make a good resolution, I'm going to eat with intention, I'm going to do business in such a way that only brings holiness into the environment, etc. The reality is I'm talking about things that live in the realm of the physical and the animal soul. Areas that don't have absolute control. So therefore, I cannot be told that I have the responsibility to guarantee the future because I actually don't have control. But when it comes to Torah mitzvahs, now we're talking the language of my neshama. And all I need to do is get the obstacles out of the way, the distraction of the Yetzer Hara out of the way. Just the very fact that innovated and driven by my neshama, I make a good resolution. That drags my neshama in, locks it into this particular mission, and now it has to fulfill it. I cannot say that I've transformed the thing, the item, the reality with which I have to do the mitzvah. That's not possible. It's out of my control. I don't control the world. So perhaps in order to do mitzvah X, I need this particular physical item. I cannot say that I've already transformed that physical item because I'm committed. Yetzer potentially could get in the way. And I don't know for certain that it's going to happen the way that I expect. But there's the gavra, the human, who's now been bound by a pledge, which means my neshama has been roped in. Because the neshama by nature is absolutely ready to do everything that the Eibishter wants. Because this is its world. You're talking my language. These are the things I care about. These are the things I have mastery over. Therefore, the person has the liability, the obligation to fulfill their words. Even though the situation hasn't yet arisen, the opportunity is for tomorrow or the next day, it doesn't matter. The neshama has been roped in with all of its power, and anything that the Torah instructs us to do comes with the resources to succeed. That the neshama can overcome whatever obstructions the body throws before it, to actually be able to keep the resolution. And that's the really good news for us. Even if we're not so spiritually developed, as soon as we make a firm commitment about something in our Torah mitzvah's growth, then the neshama is activated, the Eibishter's koichas are activated, and we really can see it through. We have to be aware of that because very often we think, I don't know if I can fulfill the achlata. Please God, because we're engaged now in learning the halachas of acquisitions, that should be the reason that brings us to the fulfillment of the pasuk and its prophecy. That the Eibush is going to once again extend his arm to take us as his possession. And the promise from Oz Yashir that in the future again we'll cross over and become the Eibishter's possession. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yikneh Samei B'Shleimus, that the Eibishter will acquire us fully, not like in the past where it was an acquisition that was followed by tzoros. This will be a complete acquisition where nobody can touch us. And that will naturally influence the other things which are considered the Eibishter's assets in the world as described in Pirkei Avos, including the acquisition of the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, Shibone, B'mheira v'yameinu mamash, specifically the third Beis Hamikdash that should be very, very soon rebuilt for all of us to see with Mashiach now.